Hello and welcome to The First Draft, a new podcast by the Foreign Policy Research Institute in which we'll examine the ideas emanating from world affairs over the next few months. I'm Robert Kaplan, Robert Strauss Houppé Chair in Geopolitics.
And I'm Dominic Green, Senior Fellow in the FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West. Hello, and welcome to The First Draft, a podcast from the Foreign Policy Research Institute, with me, Dominic Green, and Robert D. Kaplan. Robert, hello.
Hi, Dom. How are you?
I'm good. I've just finished reading your new book, The Loom of Time, Between Empire and Anarchy, from the Mediterranean to China. And given the sudden developments across the greater Middle Eastern region, this is a more than timely book. The prospect of regional warfare looms, and it's not clear what the outcomes will be in political terms, but also in the biggest picture of all, the global development that you describe in this book about a region which often seems to be breaking down rather than building up and subject to tremendous external pressures as well as internal pressures of demography and religion. To begin with, what is the loom of time?
The loom of time is a concept from Arnold Toynbee, the great late British historian, and he got it from Goethe, I think. And it has to do with Penelope weaving the winding sheet of Laertes, the father of Odysseus. She is waiting for Odysseus to come home from his travels. And she has many suitors around, many male suitors. And she tells them, as soon as I'm finished weaving the winding sheet, I will marry one of you. But every day she weaves, but at night she undoes the threads. So there's this assumption that nothing ever moves forward. There's no progress. It just goes in circles. But at the end of the day, Odysseus returns and they live happily ever after, it is presumed. And Toynbee uses it, and I use it in the book to show that progress happens, things change, but not according to a Western script. Not according to a linear progression of progress, so to speak. So just because the Arab Spring failed everywhere in 2011 does not mean you write off the Middle East and say no progress can be made. It will just, everything is, history is convoluted, it's semicircular. Progress happens. We just, we expect it to be linear and it never is.
I think this is true. When the idea of the Arab Spring is conceptually derives from the 1848 Spring of Nations. That was the way it was widely interpreted in the West by specialists and also, the media. The significance of what happened in Europe in 1848 is still of intense interest to historians, precisely because you can't easily map how the failed revolution of 1848 had this sort of pinball effect, which then played out over the following century. A running theme in this book, well, there are two or three running themes which we should address because I think they're related. One of them is the almost invisible power of our analytical concepts. And one of the articles you've written recently for the New Statesman was about how Israel, surprised by Hamas, had fallen into a similar conceptual lull as it did in 1973, when it was surprised by Egypt and Syria. The conceptual framework that you particularly refer to a lot in this book, well, there's two aspects to it. One of it seems to me to be actual experience on the ground, the empirical way of doing things, trusting the evidence of your eyes, versus the theoretical approach from first principles. And closely related, perhaps, is the concept which seems to have such a powerful grip today, the idea that the field of political outcomes is one of democracy versus autocracy. But does that even fit the greater Middle East?
No, I argue in the book that it doesn't fit. That's the Western first principles argument that is totally theoretical and has nothing to do with the facts on the ground. It's not autocracy versus democracy. You have what does an autocrat in liberal Oman have to do with North Korea or Vladimir Putin or something? It's a matter of gray shades, not black and white, hateful dictators and lovely Democrats, so to speak. So what I posit is, based on what you see on the ground, the Middle East is not between autocracy and democracy. It's really between empire and anarchy. And empire isn't just the big bad Europeans, British and French, carving up their artificial lines on the map. It's 400 years of Ottoman rule from Algeria to Iraq. It's the Abbasids, the Fatimids, the Hafsids, the Umayyads. The Middle East has been under imperial domination for thousands of years, and that has inhibited state building. And if it inhibits state building, it's obviously going to inhibit the growth of democracies, so to speak. And one word about 1848. 1848 ultimately failed because the emerging middle classes were just not quite big enough and not quite established enough and confident enough to make it happen. And that was a tragedy, because had 1848 worked, we might have had no World War I and no Adolf Hitler and all of that. The Arab Springs failed, particularly in established states like Egypt and Tunisia now, which has gone back into autocracy. Because again, like in 1848, the middle classes were just not quite big enough and not quite confident enough.
In the West, we associate state-making not just with democracy, but also with a liberal social outcome. One of the interesting points you raise repeatedly, and you find on your travels, is that the more modern people become, the stronger they feel their traditional identities, or even build them up as a psychological and communal defense against the flattening forces of modernity. The opposition that comes through here is not so much that of democracy and autocracy, which, as you say, is a conceptual fantasy in search of a reality. It's between the village and the city. And the most extreme version of that, of course, runs to the very foundations of what civilization is, which is the mobile versus the fixed, the nomad versus, the bureaucratic center. So it seems to me state making, when you're talking about it, is actually has this backlash effect, which is, of course, something we also see in 19th century Europe after 1848. The better the state becomes at organizing people, the greater they fall back on earlier resources to defend themselves against it.
Yes. Now, this actually is not an original idea. In fact, quite a number of political theorists, political scientists, philosophers have dealt with how modernity would only lead to greater ethnic consciousness, to greater religious consciousness. It wasn't just Sam Huntington and the Clash of Civilizations. It was Clifford Geertz, the great anthropologist, Barrington Moore, the political scientist from the mid-20th century, and others. It's not original. It's just that journalists and politicians don't know about it. But once you start reading into this, it's a very common idea, actually. They wouldn't be surprised at all about how states become more modern and more in a religious, ethnic sense, more ideological at the same time. That's why Sam Huntington labeled the Clash of Civilization as the end of the modern and before the culmination of modernism and the raising of the curtain of postmodernism. He saw the Clash of Civilizations as ultra modern. Kind of.
It could only be modern. It could only be facilitated by communications technology across a long distance.
And what I do in the book is I travel to Egypt, to Turkey, to Saudi Arabia with these books in my head, not with the works of fellow journalists, but with the works of all these political theorists.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, Robert. But anyway, you visit powers states which are often in disarray, such as Egypt, states which are undergoing dynamic transformation, such as Turkey, states which seem to be paralyzed under their own ideological weight, such as Iran. All of these have played major imperial roles in the Middle East at various points in its history. And in all of them, you identify things which, and it's a phrase we use, the policy elite, which is actually, I think, several different groups, all of with a professional interest in following a particular intellectual or policy fashion. All of these places, you reckon that the policy elites have got the wrong idea about whether in Egypt actually things are not stuck and ossified, but are actually changing quite dramatically. Why do we get it wrong?
Yeah, Egypt actually, is more than a bad human rights story. It's also about how El-Sisi is a slightly different kind of dictator than Mubarak was. You tend to put them all together, but they're different. And so things happen, things change. I think we get it wrong for something very basic that you alluded to earlier, is we're not really interested in the Middle East. We're interested in the American historical experience that should implant itself on the Middle East. We see the Middle East, like we see other parts of the world, as an extension of America's own, or the West's own historical experience, whereas the Middle East has its own historical experiences in each country. It's and
you do make an interesting point that you say, and you say the Western journalistic elite is your phrasing there. They do seem to prefer figures like Nelson Mandela, Václav Havel, to what you call governing types, like Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, or Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, or even Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who, as you describe in the book, is actually keeping Egypt's growth just ahead of its demographic growth.
Just barely
ahead, but enough also, meanwhile, to be reorienting towards China, for instance, which is building. Yes. I didn't even know that the Chinese had subsidized the construction of a massive new government center out near the Suez Canal, a kind of Brasilia for postmodern Egypt. I had no idea that was taking place. Why is it that we hear more about the moral exemplars, which is often what they are, versus the people who are actually making difficult decisions about governing?
Yeah, one quick thing about Egypt, Dom, which is Egypt's tragedy ultimately is that the military controls the economy. Now, think of how bad that is. The militaries are the most ossified, bureaucratic, hierarchical. You need 3 signatures for everything you do. And the Egyptian military controls the economy, and that's why the economy has not been unleashed. Egypt should not be just 1 or 2 steps ahead of its demographic growth. It should be 10 steps ahead. But that's not going to happen under what I call these Nasserite pharaohs, which started with Nasser and have continued into al-Sisi. Yes, Western elites love Nelson Mandela. They love Václav Havel. But it's interesting that when you speak to elites in developing countries, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Ethiopia, other places, and you say to them, who's your hero? Who's your role model? They always say Lee Kuan Yew. And they say Lee Kuan Yew because Lee took a little country, Singapore, and which was a malarial hellhole, as poor as most countries in Africa in the 1960s, and turned it into the most efficient, dynamic place to do Western business by the late 1990s. And Lee did it without oil. He did it through, and this is key, he did it through good, efficient, bureaucratic governance, honest dealing, and an ideology of excellence, philosophical and other excellence. When you meet Singaporean diplomats, it's like they're all philosophers, the way they quote Lee Kuan Yew and everything. But Lee was not big on democracy. To call him an autocrat is too extreme. It's a bit unfair. He was a quasi-autocrat, so to speak. And that is what the Western elites cannot tolerate about him, because they would prefer he would be a full Democrat, and Singapore would be much poorer and inefficient and have a much lower quality of life than it has.
One of the things you describe in the book is on your travels, searching for a space in which people can have dignity or even liberty in their lives between these greater forces. The chapters on Syria and Iraq, particularly hard reading in a way, for two reasons: not just the description of the experience of traveling in a police state, a brutal police state like Iraq, but also the question of the relative difference to Syria, which was
it is hard
state run by force and fear, but in which there was a greater space between the grinding plates of politics and tribal allegiance and religion.
Yeah, it is. Syria and Iraq do make hard reading, and it's easy for me to be misunderstood there. It's all about distinctions. As I said earlier, all autocrats are not the same. Oman is not North Korea. And just like Oman is not North Korea, al-Sisi was what Saddam Hussein was. And even Hafez al-Assad, the elder Assad we're talking about now, not his son Bashir. The elder Assad was not quite as cruel as Saddam Hussein. And I point out that you could actually travel unaccompanied in Syria in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, as I did. And you could file stories and send them, and people would talk, not as openly as in Lebanon, or someplace, but they would talk to you. Whereas Iraq was just a lockdown, brutal, Stalinist state where it was like everyone had a mass of concrete on their chest, like they were lying on the floor and a block of concrete was on their chest. And that's so even between two Ba'athist, Stalinist states, one was worse than the other. And it's important to make these distinctions because we learn from distinctions. That's how we learn. We learn by comparison. We learn from distinctions.
Now, as we know, Syria and Iraq are imperial legacies. One from France, one from Britain. Neither of them demonstrably can hold together as a state without that force and fear, and also without a certain narrowness of purpose in that people cannot fully express themselves, even if they can talk. They cannot develop their lives in a way. While you were writing about concepts and so on about Israel in 1973, on the same day I was writing a piece for Spectator discussing the Israel-Hamas war as a small stage in the greater rivalry between the Arab states and Iran for control of the region. As we know, historically, non-Arab powers, for instance, Turkey and Persia, have played a more powerful role politically than the Arab states. Given the almost bottoming out that we witnessed in the decade after the Arab Spring, with the collapse of Syria, the rise of ISIS, and so on, is it conceivable that the Arab states in the Middle East can organize themselves into a functioning bloc which will actually allow them to set their own course rather than be acted upon by empires?
Historically, Arab states have had a very hard time getting along together. It's true, Syria and Egypt collaborated on the 1973 war, but they quickly fell apart after the war. They had a falling out because they had different aims about that war. But it really is, as you say, Dom, it's really between Iran and the Arab states. And this is very fragile because one of the things I point out in the book is that Iran is a state with the regime has such a narrow base of support. It's like a group of North Koreans controlling a population of South Koreans. If the regime ever fell, Iran would flip 180 degrees. What I'm going to say now sounds outlandish. But if the clerical regime fell and the Revolutionary Guards with them, within a year, Iran would have diplomatic relations with Israel.
Well, it had
That's
them
how
before
crazy it is.
the Iranian Revolution. As you point out in your travels, there was a point in the 1970s when Iran and Saudi Arabia, and Israel for that matter as well, all American clients in uneasy and often unofficial cohabitation. So that is not inconceivable. One of the factors which you address, and it comes through particularly clearly, I think, in your visit to Saudi Arabia, is the inescapable and foundational presence of Islam in terms of identity, social organization, and political expression.
Yeah.
Do you think that you're quite clear? You reckon we've really got MBS's Saudi Arabia wrong?
Let me say this. MBS and the Al Sauds are the worst possible leaders except for any other that would replace them. In other words, any leader beyond NBS and any group outside of the Al Saud extended family would have to be an Islamist populist regime of some sort, and the state would probably break apart. NBS actually has made more of an outreach to Jews and Israelis, however indirect, than any leader in the Arab world since Anwar Sadat. But the difference is the fact that Sadat was an autocrat didn't bother us during the Cold War. But now the fact that NBS is an autocrat and, very ruthless one at that, bothers us, because the times have changed. But there isn't any, you can't say it loud enough. Any alternative to the current leadership in Riyadh would be far, far worse.
From there, you turn to the long episode which you describe as the ending of the American empire in the Middle East, the Second Iraq War, the confusions over what to do in Afghanistan, what to do with Libya in 2011, what to do with Syria when in its collapse into a civil war, in effect. Could it have gone differently, and where? Because one of the things you point out, and I think this is something which people I remember reading, they point out, if you do have a very brittle form of police state or autocracy, when it cracks, it will shatter, rather than develop, in the ideal form that certainly in the Anglo-American experience, people talk about, a political process by which things gradually alter in a sort of bureaucratic manner. That's not what's happened. Could it have gone differently, and where?
Yeah, the more brutal and extreme the police state, the more anarchy that comes when it falls. That's why a relatively benign, enlightened police states can develop into democracies. Look at Iberia, in the 70s. As bad as Franco and Salazar were, they were not extreme compared to dictators in other parts of the world, and therefore Spain and Portugal were able to develop. The autocracies in Tunisia and Egypt, as bad as they are not nearly as extreme as in Syria and Iraq, because Tunisia and Egypt are historically well-rooted civilizations with state identities. Syria and Iraq were artificial contraptions that can only be held together in the most brutal form. But as the Loom of Time suggests, as a concept, there can be progress, but it's not going to happen according to a Western script. Like in Egypt, you could have breaks in the ranks, in the military ranks, splits in the ranks, splits among the Islamists that could lead to still an autocratic regime, but to more free oxygen inside the whole system that eventually leads to some sort of development.
In this postmodern age that you're describing, and you say we're in the interregnum between this, and hence the chaos that we're seeing, the anarchy, the old imperial powers, the imperial civilizations, really, China, Iran, India, are reviving their influence, Turkey too. The United States, geographically and perhaps culturally, is the odd one out in this. As you point out, intervention in Libya was a failure. Non-intervention in Syria, on the other hand, you can identify qualified success. We're speaking as Israel and Hamas are fighting intensely now in Gaza, and this is only one front of a multi-front confrontation with Iran. One path forward leads to a kind of spiraling anarchy, which eventually, quite quickly, I believe, leads to an all-out regional war, quite possibly involving direct conflict between the United States and Iran. What are the alternative paths and how to get to them? Because this book is one of the reasons it's so fascinating and also even uplifting to read, is that you do see signs of recovery, growth, transformation. You know, the loom of time never ceases to work. So how to avoid a catastrophe, in effect?
Let me give you a scenario, okay, which answers your question. It's only one scenario, but it's possible. The Israelis will destroy Hamas, hopefully through a lot of targeted strikes over the next year or so, rather than a full-scale Russian-style invasion where you break everything in your path, essentially. And once we're in a post-Hamas phase, then suddenly the Saudis and others will move in. They can fund Gaza, get it started again under Palestinian leadership. You know, they could pay the bills for reconstruction and then back on the track of the Saudi-Israeli peace process, which, again, we're speaking 9 months into the future, but, it's probable. That is, the Saudis and Egyptians now have to denounce Israel because their streets demand it. But 9 months from now, it may be a different story. And if then you had a Saudi-Israeli compact, then the pressure would be really on Iran.
One of the things you say in this book, you describe your reflections on Iran as a post-mortem on the clerical Shiite state, which arose in the late 70s, early 80s. You know, journalists are often asked to write obituaries while their subjects are still alive, so that the paper has it ready for when the presses need to roll. This struck me as a similar kind of thing. But you're in no doubt that we are in the closing stages, you reckon, of the Iranian regime as we know it, and that as you describe, the great continuities of Iranian history, from the Persian empires to the Islamic empires to the secular state of the Pahlavis to the Iranian Shiite regime as we know it, you've no doubt that a further iteration is coming that would be a huge gain for not just Iranians, but for all of their neighbors.
Yes, I have a lot of faith in Iranian civilization. And I think the regime now is in its Brezhnev-Chernenko phase, referring to the last rulers, the last ossified rulers of the Soviet Union. What we need is imagination. We couldn't imagine a regime other than that of the Shah until it happened. But now we have to imagine a regime other than that of the clerics who have ruined the economy, ruined society, made Iran one of the most unhappy places on earth. Ruined the lives of not just one, but 2 generations of Iranians, ruled their material lives. And for what? So I think that the biggest thing that could change the whole region is that there would be internal upheaval in Iran, and that would affect what happens in Iraq. It could affect what happens in Egypt going forward. It could lead to another kind of Arab Spring in a different way. But this is the key, the Iranian regime.
A final question, and I know it's not the sort of one that you can answer as a yes, no, but I'm going to ask you to answer it as a yes, no. If the United States and Iran come directly to blows and the 6th and 7th fleets are in positions and so on, is that likely to help the regime in its effort to preserve its power, or to further weaken it and push it towards this kind of crack up that eventually happens to all ossified bureaucracies?
I don't know. I
That's
mean,
the third answer that wasn't available.
it would depend how it comes about and how successful a U.S. strike is against Iran. Remember, the Iranian nuclear program is not just one dome building that the Israelis destroyed in Syria in 2007 and in Baghdad in 1981. It's a series. It's a plethora of installations, most of which are underground, deep underground. That kind of an attack is enormously complex and full of risk. So it would depend how successful the attack is. But I will say this to close: if you had what is perceived as a successful U.S.-Israeli or U.S. attack or Israeli attack, military attack on Iran, and it was perceived as basically successful and humiliating to the regime, months down the road, you would have another upheaval like we saw last year.
We will have to see. This is a wonderful book, and I think the questions that are raised in it are really the ones we should be bearing in mind as we try and understand the news, but also as policy is made, that it shouldn't be made on a day-by-day basis with an eye to the evening news or social media. Shouldn't be made with an eye to the cycles of presidential elections either. It should be made to fully aware, as far as we can be aware, of these great slow-moving processes which have been at work long before the United States or liberal democracy or any of the other things that we live by, even before they existed. Thank you for laying these out so clearly.
Thank you.
You've been listening to me, Dominic Green, and Robert D. Kaplan, author of The Loom of Time, on The First Draft, a podcast from the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for joining us today. Be sure to subscribe to The First Draft on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to be notified about new episodes. To explore more podcasts and upcoming events, please visit us on www.fpri.org.